At this point, I would like to introduce Dr. Allan Tulchin, who will be serving as the comment for our 3 papers today. Dr. Tulchin is Associate Professor of History and Philosophy at Shippensburg University. He is the author of the book entitled That Man Would Praise the Lord, The Triumph of Protestantism in Nîmes, 1530 to 1570, published 2010 by Oxford University Press. Dr. Tulchin has also published numerous articles, including one in the Journal of Modern History entitled Same-Sex Couples Creating Households in Old Regime France, The Uses of the Affrèrement, an article that generated media attention and launched Dr. Tulchin into the role of public intellectual, in addition to his role as historian and teacher. He has won numerous honors, awards, and fellowships, most recently the Franklin Research Grant from the American Philosophical Society and a Teaching and Research Excellence Grant from his universities to support his current book project, which is looking at the spread of the Enlightenment in 18th century Bordeaux.
Thanks so much. It's a real pleasure to be here. In my students' world history textbook, church and state start to divide at the investiture controversy, and the process culminates in Enlightenment documents such as the U.S. Bill of Rights. I fear that, if they pay any attention at all, my students think of this as a linear process, but of course in reality it was much messier. I and many other scholars of the French Wars of Religion have insisted that religion and politics were intimately connected in 16th century France, and that ideology and religious zeal have to be understood in a social and political context. These 3 papers show the messiness of that process and also stimulate me to wonder how to better understand it. We are, after all, dealing with one of the fundamental transformations of the early modern period. Amanda Urich describes in her paper the progress of the St. Bartholomew's Massacre in Toulouse, about which we have unusually good information. It is likely but impossible to prove that the massacres in Toulouse were directed from Paris, but in Urich's analysis it becomes clear that the attack was carefully planned at the local level by a network of high Catholic officials, the Delpech, Pierre Madron, and Nicolas Latomy. One can hardly deny that religious ideology helped fuel the conflict. It would be hard to imagine that prior to the growth of the Protestant movement, the officials of Toulouse would develop such animosities that they would have attacked and killed Jean de Corras and the other Protestant judges and paraded their corpses through the streets. Nonetheless, it is also clear that pre-existing affinities and fault lines helped shape the 2 parties. The men who organized the massacre were intimately linked by marriage and other close associations. These relationships helped provide the trust necessary to permit the conspiracy to go forward. And no one considered that religion was a private matter. It would be interesting to know, however, how the wars of religion changed the politics of Toulouse. What did the parties conclude as a result? How did their attitudes change? Did Catholics remain intransigent opponents of Protestantism, or did they become more prepared to compromise? Gregg turns up some remarkable evidence of the fluid boundaries between religion and politics in a remarkable place, the body of the Catholic clergy of Mâcon. Clergy there bore arms, kept watch, wore military garb, doublets, not cassocks, and even grew beards. All of which suggests that the clergy did not see or wish to present themselves as having separated themselves from the world. This was, of course, traditionally forbidden, and while at least some clergymen, such as Father Scipion Gary, clearly knew this, in Bereiter's account it seems that many members of the nor did they see themselves as humble artisans. They chose to portray themselves as gentlemen, members of the second estate as well as of the first. In short, this suggests that the church hierarchy, despite Trent and other initiatives, had yet to make clerical culture conform to official policy. To some extent, the clergy could justify these deviations by arguing that they were necessary given the extraordinary conditions of civil war. But it seems to me that what was happening here is more the survival of older attitudes. I'd like to know how long such attitudes persisted. Surely they eventually changed, but when and why? Scott Marr considers the conflicts between Philippe Duplessis-Mornay's roles as a writer and political figure. When Duplessis-Mornay addressed the inhabitants of Saumur, he insisted that neither Protestants nor Catholics should insult the other for the sake of public peace. Likewise, Saumur's Catholics insisted that they had the freedom to pick their own preachers. It was a religious matter, Marr says. I would have liked to know the exact language they used here. These exchanges suggest that both sides were familiar with the concept that religion was a private matter, not the direct concern of the state unless it provoked disorder. Duplessis-Mornay is exceptionally clear, asking rhetorically, in an order so absolute, so general and so clear, not addressed to me alone, but to all inhabitants, not in regard to religion, but purely in regard to matters of state. If it was up to me to make this distinction, to have this prejudice of persons? However, using this language when it suits you is not the same thing as accepting it when it doesn't. Members of minority religions are much more likely to favor church-state separation than members of the majority. When Duplessis-Mornay published Mystère d'Iniquité, a learned work attacking Catholicism, he clearly believed that this was well within his rights as a private citizen, expressing his religious conscience. I don't quite agree with Marr's comment that such criticisms rendered Duplessis-Mornay's earlier exhortations hollow. Huguenots et papistes were treated as grave insults in the 16th century. I didn't enjoy it when a student tried to convert me to evangelical Christianity, but I'd take a very different tone if one of them called me a kike. However, Catholics did not merely try to refute Duplessis-Mornay's arguments. Jacques-Auguste de Thou immediately worried that Duplessis-Mornay could be reigniting the fires of civil war. Note that, at least in the quotes Marr gives us, de Thou was not saying that Duplessis-Mornay had broken the law, merely that his criticisms were inopportune. That suggests that at least some members of the Catholic elite believed that people had the right to hold and express religious opinions. It is my sense, however, that most Catholics who accepted that French Protestants could exist and express themselves did so as a matter of pragmatic concession, not as a matter of principle. Evidence to the contrary would be most interesting. For all the emphasis on the 16th century in Henry Cayman's classic history of religious toleration, it is my sense that most people did not accept it. Those who fought for toleration in this period were either members of the minority or argued on pragmatic grounds. Toleration had to grow on the ground in the lived social experience of Europe's communities before it could be erected into a principle accepted by consensus. The intellectual history of toleration ignores the social context at its peril. Many thanks for these excellent papers, and let me close by summarizing the questions I have been asking in this comment. So for Amanda, what did the parties conclude as a result of the events of 1572? How did their attitudes change? What effect did this have? Did Catholics remain intransigent opponents of Protestantism, or did they become more prepared to compromise? And for Gregg, was the behavior of Macron's priests that you have identified new or old, an adaptation to emergency conditions, or something else? And finally, for Scott, when were arguments for privatizing religious belief employed? Were they to advance one's confessional interests or to restrain one's own side? How instrumental were they, in other words? I very much look forward to your thoughts and those of the audience. Thank you.
Okay, at this point, I would like to give the panelists an opportunity to respond to their questions, and then we'll open up discussion to the audience.
Right. Yeah. Let me respond to a couple of things that Allan said. And first, to say that it's, I will respond to the question that you asked. But first, just a comment about the kind of structure of the paper. It's a rather odd position I find myself in, to be arguing, with you about putting politics into the wars of religion when I'm always arguing with you about putting religion into the wars of religion, right? So yeah, so it's rather, so certainly I would not say kind of in this case that that religion didn't inspire these deep enmities that I'm kind of talking about as well. I think that the advantage of this source and and a couple of other narratives is that we have the opportunity to look at some of the the other kind of sources kind of hostility that still suggest how integrally connected religion and kind of politics were. To the question about 1572 and did it ultimately lead Toulousans to a kind of position of compromise, and all I need to do briefly, I think, is to recall the story of the Calas affair. Within really days kind of after these events, in spite of the discussion of kind of who served on the city council and who didn't, that kind of I described, militants kind of were sort of reorganizing, and if anything, for the next 2 decades, I would say that relations became kind of even more tense, kind of and even more vicious, to the extent that one of the parliamentary presidents who I cited, kind of would be arrested, kind of and executed, kind of in the 1590s, clearly on. I wouldn't say kind of trumped up charges, but clearly as a result of the kind of tensions that are existent in Toulouse throughout much of the 16th century, and really are fostered in 1562. I think that the fact that 1572 falls a kind of decade after the abortive attempt is not lost on kind of Toulousans, and that there are kind of repeated celebrations, as of the triumph of Catholicism in Toulouse that will continue for 200 years.
Just to respond to Allan's comments, a lot of the kind of clerical misbehavior that we all hear about and is kind of common topics for Protestant polemic against Catholic clergy in this period. A lot of that is similar to what clerics in Macon in particular are up to in the period prior to the League. There are lots of complaints about clergy not attending Mass. There are complaints about clergy, keeping a servant girl or somebody in their house, or sometimes attending taverns, these kinds of things. But the particular aspects of clergy not dressing right and growing facial hair and these kinds of things really pop up, at least in my documents, in the League period. So that could also coincide as well with more increased Episcopal concern for proper clerical behavior. So there could be more of a sense that clergy are not behaving like they're supposed to be behaving, particularly at the same time that that they are growing facial hair and they are taking an active part in civic militia operations and these kinds of things. In terms of kind of the active engagement of clergy in civic arms bearing, a lot of, it's interesting because in some of the other towns I've looked at, clergy, they have exemptions from these types of activities, either from the king or from the noble governor. And they often fight, and they claim that they have this exemption and therefore they shouldn't be mobilized for militia duty. But in Macon, that's really not the case, and I'm not entirely sure what to attribute that to, other than at least some of them were interested in participating and playing this type of civic role. But yeah, in a lot of other towns, clergy were quick to pull out a document saying, we're exempt from not only guard duty, but stationing troops in our cloisters and contributing to defense taxes and these kinds of things. So I think Matt Cohen in particular presents an interesting case. And admittedly, these are emergency conditions. A lot of the documents, a lot of the municipal records when clergy are mobilized for militia operations, the reason given is this is a case of imminent peril. So that's why we're calling on them. And so admittedly, yes, these are emergency conditions, but I think what's interesting for me is that clergy become very important, civic and political actors in this period and are contributing to the dynamics of sectarian conflict during the wars of religion in a different way than it seems like they'd done during the previous decades. So.
Allan, you asked the very question that I hoped you wouldn't ask, because it's the very question that I am asking myself. And, this paper was sort of trying out an idea of
Sorry.
It's fine, it happens. Here we go. So, an attempt to see Duplessis-Mornay's actions as perhaps principled. But in the, you pointed to the language in my paper, the seeming hollowness, the seeming contradiction in his stance. I'm trying to say maybe it's not a contradiction, but maybe it is. So your question of when were his arguments for privatizing religious commitments deployed? When did he remind townspeople, Catholics as well as Protestants, to stop with the insults, don't invite the Jesuits, let the Catholics on the town watch? When were these deployed? First thing to say, it is relevant to know that we really only have Duplessis-Mornay's his evidence. And of course, he presents himself as high-minded, as principled, as reasonable, and his opponents, Catholics as well as Protestants, as out of hand and need to be tamed. So there's that problem. He also, he didn't really talk about Catholic-Protestant relations when things were going well. It's only when things seemed to be going badly, or could be going badly, that he summoned a meeting or he wrote a letter when there was a trouble. So to this question, when were these arguments for privatizing religious commitment deployed? They seem to be employed on two occasions. When a religious emotion in Saumur seemed to be unsettling the public order, and when his own authority seemed to be in trouble. And so yeah, you nailed me. There is definitely a self-serving political edge to his rhetoric. He is a member of a religious minority in a city where Catholics are the majority. He came to be the governor of Saumur as a result of a peace treaty between Henry III and Henry of Navarre. Because he was not from the region, he was not from the Saumurois, not from Anjou, he didn't really have a lot of allies. We all know that patron-client relationships were essential to maintaining order. He didn't have a lot of clients in the region that he could draw their support from. So he's in a vulnerable position there. He's Protestant. The king is Catholic. So his own authority is in real jeopardy a lot of the time. So when were these I would like to, I'm trying to make a case, and maybe asking you, how convincing did you find it? But I do think that there was a principle to his statements that coexistence can work, and the basis for coexistence should be our shared civic identity. This is a message, an argument that he deploys well before he is the governor of Saumur. So even before he has a stake in what's happening in Saumur. He is deploying this language. But I can't deny that that his political authority is part of what he is trying to protect. So that's the best I can do.
Thank you. At this point, we have questions.
Hi, I have a question for Gregg. Do you think that these clergy, or is there any evidence that these clergy are actually using earlier models when it was acceptable for there to be priests and military, the Crusades or the various military orders that were established in the Middle Ages? Because I was wondering, are they hearkening back, or do you see that in their language anywhere that they may be, sort of comparing themselves to the earlier medieval orders?
Yeah, that's a great question. Not in this particular case, no. I mean, there's no references to, like Julius II or, the warrior popes. The military religious orders, there's really no reference there. So in that sense, it leads me to wonder, okay, what other factors are motivating this engagement, aside from seeing the necessity of doing so and participating in the defense of Catholic Macon, during the League. But no, I'm still looking for for evidence that there is a connection between what was perhaps acceptable before, because again, obviously canon law has always forbade clerics from bearing arms, even in many defensive situations, because it involves them necessarily in the spilling of blood. So on the books, it's verboten, but when a lot of bishops come from military families and their family has a tradition of arms bearing, I mean, that's basically their social and cultural role, there has to be some link there, I think. But it's not terribly explicit in the sources, unfortunately. That's a great question.
This is Ed Gray. My question is for Scott. I'm very intrigued by what you're getting into here. And one thing that sort of stuck out to me was the timing of the release of these two tracks. And, he seems very keyed into keeping public order. But then why did he publish these two inflammatory things within, such a close time period to these two very momentous occasions that upset the public order? So I wonder if there's something in the timing that you can tease out of there to talk about his sincerity.
For his first treatise, I'm not sure he intended for it to come out when it did, several months after the Edict of Nantes was signed. He had been working on it for years. Publication delays held it up. I think he had finished it in 1595, but it took 3 years for various reasons for it to appear. He never said anything to suggest that he was embarrassed, that he recognized that it was bad timing. Henry IV was really wounded that his friend and ally would release this long attack on Catholic practice at such a sensitive time. But Duplessis Mornay didn't sort of do anything to suggest that he was also aware that this was bad timing. Now, for his other treatise on the papacy, I almost kind of wonder that if he didn't care that it was, or rather that if it was a troubled time, that what he wanted to draw attention to, if this is a troubled time, it's because papal power is much too great. That it is in fact the king's death was what I'm trying to prevent future instances of by reigning in the power of the papacy, or really calling call attention to the hollow basis of papal claims to authority. So for the second treatise, I think it was exactly because it was such a sensitive time that he felt it urgent to release this treatise.
Thank you for a wonderful panel, and frankly also, Allan, a model comment. My question is for Gregg, going back to some of the same things. I'm curious about Macon. Is there anything about Macon that makes its clerical population special? Like, for example, were there lots of clerics who were maybe still in minor orders, or were there particularly a large number of them who happened to be at about the right age to be performing defensive functions? So I guess the question I'm really asking is, can we expect this example to be generalizable to other cities?
Yeah, that's a great question. The case with Macon in particular, at least what I find interesting, is because the bishop, Luca Almani, is a very ardent ligueur, and he is frequently not there. And you get the sense from the documents that, so we know that towards the end of the League period, I mean, he basically just went back to Italy because there was no way he was going to recognize Henry IV. So he goes back to Italy. But he is frequently absent throughout the League period. And so there's a very interesting relationship that exists between the city council and the kind of the clerical leaders of the cathedral chapter. And they attend a lot of the council meetings. They are frequently involved in kind of side discussions that get called if there's a particularly imminent threat to the city, an army is supposed to pass by. And so they seem to, they seem to have some kind of autonomy, and some room for action without having to, defer to the bishop. Obviously, the bishop himself had his own ideas about what clerics were supposed to be doing when he was, complaining about their dress or growing facial hair. So, I mean, I get the sense that if he was in town more, this would be something that the cathedral canons in particular they wouldn't be as heavily involved in the militia operations and, going out and actually taking up arms and protecting their chateau and things like this. I mean, I get the sense that he would have maybe put a stop to that, at least in some sense. But yeah, I mean, I think, I'm trying to think of, in terms of, the clerics in Macon, I mean, they're really it for kind of the clergy in the city. I mean, there's not really a presence yet of a lot of the other kind of Counter-Reformation religious orders that come into a lot of towns at this time. So they're kind of on their own in Macon. And they're the ones that get called on to participate in all of these different, civic defense functions. So yeah, I think there would be similar conditions in other cities as well. If it's like Beaune, for instance. Beaune did not have a bishop, and they did not have any other kind of major religious establishment besides the collegiate church. And clerics in Beaune are doing similar things. I'm not finding the evidence for beards and whatnot on the part of the clergy in Beaune, but no, I just, from kind of comparisons I've done with clergy in other cities, the ones in Macon seem to be particularly involved in the militia functions in a way that stands out from clergy in other cities. And so so I am still definitely trying to piece together why exactly they're more concerned to actually participate rather than kind of wave their exemption in the air and say, hey, we're not supposed to be involved in this. So does that answer? Okay. Thank you.
We have time for one more question. So,
Jeff Warren, Manhattan College. I don't want to beat a dead horse or a bearded clergyman to death, but it seems to me that perhaps one of to broaden on Leslie's point, is it Macon that's unique or Burgundy that is unique? Because in what I know about northern Burgundy, the references, I never saw the beards, I didn't look that deeply, but what I see is the crusading spirit. And there is an enormous number of cities, small cities in northern Burgundy where the clergy do serve in the watch. They actually serve in the watch into the 18th century. And the references are not to Julius II, but to the Templars and the Hospitaliers, and that's where Beaune comes up again. There's that crusading element that is, at least in my knowledge, particularly strong in Burgundy. And I wonder whether that might not be a way to understand why this is going on here, and also just to remind you that this is bleeding into Champaign as well. This is not so restricted a pattern. So.
Great question. Yeah, part of what is very interesting from the documents in Macon is that whenever a justification is given for clergy participating in civic defense or defending their chateau, there is a noticeable absence of religious language. There's far more. These are civic concerns that really seem to be driving this engagement. But yeah, there's no references to, Templars or anything like that, unfortunately. The concern seems to be very local. We need to defend from, either the heretics that are over in Saint Jean de Lone, or the military governor of Macon was himself, in the period just prior to the League, was himself a Protestant sympathizer, and the city council finally succeeded in kicking him out, but then he continually harasses Macon. So the new military governor comes in, and the clergy are actually involved in military operations to go besiege his chateau, the Comte de Cruzy. So they're involved in military operations that are very focused on local enemies. And yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, there is a stark kind of absence of religious language in talking about why they're actually going to participate in these endeavors. And they get involved in a lot of other things too. The nearby city of Tournou, there's kind of a putsch among the politique in Tournou, and the abbey chapter there gets holed up in their abbey, and they're barricaded inside, and Macon the military governor Macon sends a delegation, and the clergy are involved in transporting the troops and weapons up to Tournou, and I don't know, they're doing lots of various things that seem to be local concerns, I think. That's the sense I'm getting from the document. So, but yeah, great comment.
Thank you. And just before we wrap up this, I'd like to thank all of you for participating in this webcast, and thank David Smith and the folks at H France for making this available online. I hope you will continue the discussion online, and those of us who are here will continue it over drinks at our reception. So thank you all, and thanks for our panel.